prisons kept us safe, the US would be the safest nation in all of human history. And people usually laugh or smile or smirk when we say, when we put together the safest nation in all of human history and the United States. It's like, what? Far from it, right? It's such a dangerous place in so many ways.
Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm of the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I am your host. I am a professor of theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio and the lead pastor of the Loft Faith community in Westwood in Los Angeles, California. I always get that mixed up. Whatever. Anyway, today I feel like I've been doing this long enough that I probably should know how to introduce myself, but I'm like, it's because Westwood technically isn't a city; it's in Los Angeles. Today is a political trinity episode. So it is me, Wesley, and Everest.
We're
So
back.
back
Hey.
together. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Andrew Krinks, who is the author of an amazing book that we will be discussing, White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Incarceration. I'm going to read his bio and then give him a chance to introduce himself. So Dr. Krinks is a writer, educator, scholar, organizer, and movement builder working at the intersection of religion, racial capitalism, mass criminalization, and abolition in Nashville, Tennessee. He teaches college and seminary courses on religion, theology, ethics, carcerality, abolition, and social justice, and conducts participatory action research on the impacts of prisons and policing. In continuity with his teaching and writing, he organizes and educates with others in Nashville for a world of safety and abundance beyond police and prisons. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on the episode today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I came across a blog post that Andrew wrote where I'm sure it's probably at the book rollout, I suspect, where they have you do all this extra, writing to get people to buy the book. And I read what turns out to be the beginning of your third chapter and was so struck by how much it tied together what I see happening in our current social and political moment with respect to the Trump administration and mass criminalization and just the language around immigrants and other people of color, but broadly from his perspective, immigrants as a threat, right? And so while I know you wrote this book and it was published prior to this current administration and all the things we're seeing happening with respect to Trump and his cabinet ostensibly declaring war on democratic cities like where we live in Los Angeles. Like, we saw the National Guard like all over the place this summer. I'm curious, Andrew, just if we could start maybe you giving your reflections on the role religion is playing, right? In this moment right now with respect to ICE, with respect to the recruitment videos that we're seeing, and just how some of the work you've done kind of can address this moment we are right now with this rise of the way in which Trump is using the military and using the police and using a force like ICE.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first thing to say is that, Trump's rise to office again would not have been possible again apart from the influence of white Christian evangelical nationalists, all the different dimensions of this behemoth of European American Christianity in the U.S. And so, he's very, even though it's evident that he personally probably is not all that reverent or devoted, perhaps, in the ways that some may expect a Christian to be. Nevertheless, these ideologies of white Christian nationalism, what some call Christofascism, very much permeate his entire policy platform, Project 2025. The rest of it, authored in large part by people who come from these ways of thinking and acting. So, it's not that big of a surprise that we would see, as we're seeing, these kinds of religious cues, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes more implicitly, peppered into the public-facing rhetoric around sending police in to deal with immigrants and with unhoused people and with criminals and all these other people that they like to deride on the regular. And so, one of the ways that I look at and have been interpreting what's been going on lately is a couple things. One, one of the more explicit channels from uh, through which this discourse is coming has been the Twitter account, the X account of DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And as we were discussing prior to coming on, they have these, at least two, maybe more, these kind of ICE, I don't know what you would call it. I mean, they're partly recruitment videos. They're partly just kind of like, yeah, little advertisements for ICE, like highly produced. And both of them feature passages from scripture. So the first is from Isaiah 6:8, where it's this line, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. So this is a very popular verse in what we could call thin blue line culture. Thin blue line culture is a
Mhm.
kind of a police culture that revolves around this idea that police are the thin blue line that separates civilization from chaos. In other ways, that it's often put good from evil. And so this is a mythology that really undergirds a lot of contemporary policing discourse, like among police themselves in, these kinds of different channels of communication online where this language thrives. There's also a visual culture attached to it with the American flag with the blue line in the middle of it that you'll see on cars a lot, and different imagery around a thin blue line around some kind of black background. And so this is imagery that is only a couple decades old, or the notion of a thin blue line is only a couple of decades old, but the imagery as a subculture in our country has really thrived in the last 10 or so years, I would say. And it gets pretty explicitly religious when you dive into some of the ways that people talk about thin blue line culture, and the fact that the police are the thin blue line. I analyze this in the last chapter of my book, where there are multiple ways that it's construed, where police exist to ensure that civilization can continue to exist, which essentially means that without police, literally all hell would break loose. And the hell thing there is important. We can talk about that more too. Uh, but that without the presence of this thin blue line of police in all their forms, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol or corrections officers or police officers on the street, there's this idea that they are doing God's work quite literally. I trace this in the book too. There's a lineage of thought through the 70s up to the present where, the Bible gets interpreted through this like thin blue line or idea. There was a police Bible translation or edition of the Bible in the 70s that it had Romans 13 instead of the government. It uses police and things like that. So this is a prominent idea. But to get to the DHS posts, what they are doing there is pulling a verse that is very popular within that culture. In my own city of Nashville, the Fraternal Order of Police, the police so-called union, I say so-called because police are not part of the labor movement, even though they try to be, because quite simply, police have been the enemy of the labor movement for a long time. But that's an aside.
Tell the people,
Um,
though. Tell the people. It's true.
so they, and this is noteworthy. The lodge, they have their home base. The lodge of the Nashville Fraternal Order of Police is at the Andrew Jackson Lodge. Andrew Jackson, for those who don't know, slaver, killer of indigenous peoples. His mansion right outside of Nashville, still a tourist attraction. So they at the Andrew Jackson Lodge paid for an inscription, an engraving of this passage on the wall of the police headquarters that was built maybe 9-10 years ago. So it's right there on the wall, this exact verse. And it is, very popular, which is this idea of, everyone's too afraid to do this work of getting the bad guys, of saving civilization from evil. But some of us are brave enough to do it, and we say, "Here I am, send me." And so, even if you don't have to, they don't have to announce this as saying, "Hey, look, we're Christian nationalists, we're Christo-fascists." You don't have to say that. You can just use a passage like this to channel God's voice to say, God's work is to target non-white people coming from other places and to dispel them from our midst. And the message is quite clear. And the second video that's worth naming here is one that cites verse from Proverbs. The wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as a lion. There's lots of imagery in thin blue line culture of the kind of the sheepdog or the lion or this beast that is kind of aggressive enough to overpower the other beasts, the evil beasts of society. But interestingly, the tweet that was attached to that video reads like this: "To every criminal illegal alien in America, darkness is no longer your ally. You represent an existential threat to the citizens of the United States, and U.S. Border Patrol's Special Operations Group will stop at nothing to hunt you down." And so uh, that is on the tweet, and then the video has the Proverbs verse. So it's quite clear. I think of this quite honestly as a manifestation of a kind of holy war. Um, I have a long phrase, or like conglomerate of words, a holy racial class war, that I use to think about what this is, because there's a class element where unhoused people are being targeted, immigrants of low economic status are being targeted, non-white people are being targeted, and they're being targeted in a way that's being articulated in and through religious scripture and imagery. So it's hard to avoid the idea that I argue in the book, which is that even aside from these super explicit tweets about these things, that policing has served a religious function for quite a long time. But I'll stop there. We can maybe get more into what I mean by that. But
So this is a good point for me to invite our listeners to make sure that when you're reading Andrew's book, I would encourage you to read it with other people, with groups of folks, like to have conversations, because it's like it's not depressing. I would not say it's not, but it is like you right. It's so thoroughly researched and argued that I know people. I know because there's a few listeners that I know will be like, "Oh, I don't know if how they feel about." I'm like, get the book, read, because every counter argument, like you anticipate different people's counter arguments, and you go right to it, and even the fact that the explicitly racialized language, right, about darkness and lightness, like that, like me, as you said, like my stomach literally hurt. It contracted because I know this gets into my own work with animality, with non-human animals, and so much about what's happening with respect to the language around policing and war and violence has to do with dehumanizing people of color to the extent that your actions against them are seen as not sinful because these are not humans, essentially, right? This is the kind of book that I think should be read in groups. Definitely read in I would say this is an excellent kind of church, read if you are a part of a religious community that does this kind of thinking. Even if you just read honestly the introduction, I would say if you just read that, you will be far and away equipped to have a more informed conversation with respect to topics of abolition and the religious function of mass criminalization. And actually, I think this might be a good point, Everest, for you to ask the question that you had posed earlier, well, in our pre-show meeting about kind of how Andrew got here.
Well, first I'm going to say I loved that overview and kind of the tie to the modern moment. And I think I regularly feel like I'm living in a dystopian political satire, but hearing that the current overpowered government police force that is kidnapping people are setting up shop in Andrew Jackson's old house is very I couldn't have written that. You know what I mean? Like if I read that in a book, I'd be like, that's too on the nose. That's crazy. Anyway, so my question for Andrew was kind of three parts, which is what was kind of your origin in Christian spaces / in deconstructing your ideas of hell, and then what was your start in prison abolition spaces, and then when did those things converge for you?
Great, thanks for those questions. So yeah, I do narrate a little bit of this in the preface of the book, which are the first pages that you open to. So if folks do pick up a copy, definitely invite people to check this part out. But I'm born and raised in a Protestant, conservative, religious household and tradition. Um, I come from the Churches of Christ tradition, is what I was raised in.
Wow.
In
I was like, you and
Me
Wesley. I was like,
too.
okay. I was like, yeah.
Hey,
I was
there
like,
you go.
oh, yeah, okay, all right.
So I was born and raised in southern New Jersey, a semi-rural, semi-suburban area outside of Philadelphia, and went to church 3 days a week, three times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and that was a big part of my upbringing in ways that I am thankful for, including having a real strong ethic of love and care, and things like that that I definitely inherited from my upbringing. And I also inherited fear, including fear of hell from an early age. And, the way I narrate it in the beginning of the book is that I was coming into consciousness in the late 1980s. And we watched the Philadelphia news in our house. And so you'd see a lot of Black criminality portrayed. And it turns out very disproportionately, of course. There were the history of propaganda and of media's role in spreading ideas about Black criminality. But I grew up to be afraid of the world around me in a lot of ways. And I think in retrospect, I see that the fear of hell and the fear of non-white people and their alleged criminality, their allegedly inherent criminality, really kind of go together in retrospect, in my imagination as a young person. And so, yeah, I was radicalized politically around the time of the post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, when I had this existential crisis. Oh, my people at church say bomb them all. My atheist and agnostic friends at school say that's morally problematic. We're against the war. And that kind of led to the second chapter of my life as someone in a Christian tradition, where I was asking big questions that nobody had answered for me before, about could I care about justice and peace and also be a Christian. It turned out I could, but it had not been modeled to me yet at that point. But 20 plus years past that point, I've been on a second phase of the journey of being in the Christian tradition, of seeing all the ways that liberation and release from captivity and the like are central to at least one stream of the Christian tradition. We could argue about whether it's the central one, and argue about the fact that the predominant one has not been that in terms of the number of people and the ways of people orienting and worshiping and whatnot within it. But nevertheless, that tradition within the tradition is the one that I feel very much a part of. So within that, in the late or in around 2007 or 8 or so is when I first was invited into prison by a former professor of mine, um, to just have some community, a spiritual community, a book club community, with folks at the local women's prison and men's maximum security prison here in Nashville. And that was transformative for me, because I encountered not the monsters that I had been told I would encounter by all of culture growing up, but people with great depth and complexity and intelligence and love and capacity for good. And that was transformative for me, and I've continued in those relationships ever since, and formed new ones as well. And around that time and shortly after, I was proximate to people experiencing homelessness through my work as an editor of a street newspaper, and was encountering people regularly talking about how much they were harassed by cops on the street just for trying to sit or sleep or stand or use the bathroom or eat without a roof over them. And that, plus the emerging what would become the Black Lives Matter movement shortly after that, with Trayvon Martin and others, uh, became really kind of locked in on what are these institutions? Why do they exist? Why did I grow up thinking about them as the good guys? Why did I wear a plastic police helmet as a kid, with toy guns? Like, why is that my reality? What's that have to do with my being a white person, my economic background, class background, etc.? So that led me down the path of understanding that prisons do not exist to keep us safe, but for something altogether different from that, namely to maintain a hierarchical order that's required by the social and economic systems we live under. And so those kind of met my abolitionism and my Christianity, met through the context of relationship with people who were incarcerated, um, Christian people who were incarcerated, and through relationship with people who had been thinking along these lines for a lot longer than me, and seeing all the ways up close and personal at how if people were better off after their entry into prison or their departure from it, that it was in every case in spite of the institution, not because of it. And when you start to unravel the myths around how prisons keep us safe and prisons repair and rehabilitate and etc., lots of other threads come undone at the same time. And so the relationships, the learning, the organizing experiments, and trying to support efforts and lead efforts for greater accountability around police and to see how much they pushed back on it, and for eventually for abolition and divestment and things like that. And so, yeah, it's been a learning process. But at this point, I see my spirituality as a Christian and my abolitionism are very much inseparable. I write about that in the conclusion of the book a little bit, and I'm writing about it more now in my next project. So yeah, happy to say more now or in the future about that. But that's a little bit about those backgrounds.
No, I mean that is a deeply moving origin story, and I think we must be about the same age because I would say my own trajectory follows similar in terms of September 11th, and the response to that to me was shocking. Like, shocking having in my mind seeing, like, I don't know if you remember reading the letter that Osama bin Laden, or if you read the letter that Osama bin Laden that had got published, that he wrote basically kind of describing why this happened. And I remember reading it and thinking like, yeah, okay, like, like as a
He's
Black
mad for a
American,
reason.
yeah, I was like, what? Like, we wasn't in there doing nothing, you know what I'm saying? Like, and so not justifying his actions, but from a position of when you feel as though you are cornered and you have no choice, people are going. You can't harass people and expect them to attack. That's all I thought.
Mhm.
And that is not then an excuse to then go on a genocidal attack and murder people. And I think what I hear you describing wrestling with, Andrew, is this. I think so many of us who identify now as, I would call myself more of a Howard Thurman person, follower of the religion of Jesus, I would say, is what I'm trying to do, right? Not necessarily progressive Christian is the term that we use to describe our politics, but I think very much so that I'm in line with the religion of Jesus. There's this way in which I was raised to take the Bible seriously. And when you do that and you you read the parable of the Good Samaritan, you read the Beatitudes, I'm like, okay, this seems like I'm just doing what it says. And it seems like y'all are trying to not do that. And there's this tension that requires a kind of for me to continue going down that path that some of the my peers continued down, even my friends who were Black, required me to stop asking questions and stop thinking. and just accept that there's some things beyond my knowing that I just wasn't able to do. And so, no, thank you for articulating. I think that's, people that are, those of us in our 40s probably can follow a similar trajectory. Everest got to the question about hell, and we're gonna probably ask. I know there's another question about that, because what I see you doing in this book is really helping us understand how some of these concepts that we have inherited around hell, around sin, and around salvation give us the framework to then believe that what we do with our carceral system is right and just and moral, right? And so I'm going to share this and ask you the question. As I was reading your book, even though intellectually I knew the argument you're going to make and I agreed with them, I found myself unsettled because it's an invitation to imagine a world without prisons, and I was nervous. Like, just to be like reading it, I was more like, wow, this, I'm again Thermonite, try to pay attention to my insides, what's going on in my spiritual world. And I'm like, wow, I'm really nervous about this. The invitation he's invited me to imagine, I don't really feel like I want to imagine that because, and I'm like, why am I afraid? Like, I don't even like police. No experience have I had with the police have I felt safe. And yet there's still something in me that's internalized this narrative, right, around what, and you talk about in the book with respect to safety and what this looks like in terms of salvation. And so the question I have is I'm wondering if you could help us connect the dots between the notion of sin that we grew up with, which I think you talk about, the borrowing from Augustine, I think it was, but I can't quite remember, sin, and then how it moves into this idea of what salvation is, particularly kind of the substitutionary atonement, and how that leads to what you describe as a carceral soteriology. Because I think that connection to me was like, oh, this is how we can look at the fact that we have the most people in prison in the world and think that this is somehow okay. Because we think this is a path towards some kind of salvation, right? Which I hadn't, again, put that together in the way you did until you articulated the book. So if you can kind of lay that out for our listeners, I think that'd be really helpful for them to kind of see how the previous kind of ways we were taught to think theologically led us to this place.
So, in addition to having the background where sin and salvation were talked about a lot, my graduate studies were in Christian theology. And at the time, at Vanderbilt, during my PhD, we had our qualifying exams required us to read all the one version of the canon of like Christian theology, which required a lot of dusty old texts that it turns out influence so much about our world, even though they are very, very old in some cases. So as I was doing that reading of Augustine and of Anselm and of Luther and Calvin and so many others, I was also involved in the movements against police violence and for racial justice and whatnot. So they were mutually informative. I was reading about sin and salvation according to people who died many hundreds of years ago, and interpreting the world around me in light of what was happening. And so I began to kind of trace out and really highlight as I was reading how people were talking about how these great thinkers of the Christian tradition were talking about sin and salvation. And what I trace in the book is what I call it's a trajectory within Christian thought. I'm not suggesting that it is the only trajectory, but it is a predominant trajectory within Christian thought. The starting point is that humans are corrupted in some way, like something's not right. Original sin, we're inheritors of the fall, and therefore come into the world corrupted inherently. We're disposed to sin, and that corrupted state leads almost inevitably to what I trace throughout these thinkers. And by the way, I mentioned some of them there. Augustine, Anselm, and Calvin lived across a span of more than 1,000 years, but I trace the continuity between them because they're some of the most influential thinkers in the tradition who give us a lot of what we have, not just in Christianity, but in society beyond Christianity proper. And so what this corruption leads to is basically what boils down to a refusal to be properly subject to a life-giving and benevolent God. And that refusal to be properly subject, to be disobedient, would be another way of putting it, leads to a state of either indebtedness or condemnation. So it depends on who you're looking at. Augustine and Anselm emphasize indebtedness a little bit more, but punishment starts to come in through Anselm, and then Calvin really takes it towards punishment full-fledged, with a little bit of the debt stuff in there too. But it's basically a relationship of obligation where you're in the wrong, you've wronged God in some way, and that there's a need to correct the situation. And there's a lot of different like nuance within each of these thinkers and lots of other thinkers besides them around what exactly is wrong in the condition of sin. But I boil it down to this problem of the refusal to be properly subject, because that's the common denominator through all of them, is that to sin is to disrupt the proper God-human hierarchy in some way. You think about the Adam and Eve narrative about, taking on godlike knowledge and capacity in some ways to disrupt the relationship of hierarchy. And the hierarchical relationship, we need to remind ourselves, is not strictly abusive, in the Christian tradition. The reason for the hierarchy is because God provides everything for you and gives you everything you need, and you don't have to go looking for it for yourself, and saves you and protects you and provides for you, etc. But nevertheless, the hierarchy is required for that to be possible. And so when humans start to presume a little bit too much godlike like capacity or power or knowledge or whatever, that's when things start to get messed up. And it's not just in each person that it gets messed up. It creates disorder cosmically. It creates disorder socially. So when people are not in their right place, and that's a phrase that's important when we talk about what policing and prisons and capitalism are about, and white supremacy. When people are not in their right place in a hierarchy of some kind, that throws everything off. So it's not just about individual sin. It's about how people's individual sin, namely some manifestation of refusing to be properly in your place, subject to a benevolent God, who's also figured as a sovereign in most cases, a monarch, whatever it might be. That to do that is to unleash disorder in some way that must be dealt with. Sin is a state of condemnation and indebtedness, which is you're essentially enslaved or enchained to sin, to that state. There's really interesting metaphors in Augustine's Confessions, metaphors of like clanking chains that deafened me to my own like pride, and how I tried to run away like a slave does, but you brought me back. It's like all these language of people pursuing too much freedom that gets reined in. That there's a need to rein it in because that's seen as like the pathway to sin or a manifestation of sin. And that gets into the salvation part of things, where if the problem of sin is the problem of the refusal to be properly subject, properly in your place in relation to a divine sovereign, a benevolent sovereign, but still a sovereign, then the answer to that problem of refusal to be properly subject is a return to proper subjection. That corrects the problem. And how do you get to that proper subjection again? It's either through payment of debt or satisfaction of a punishment of some kind. So if you're condemned, you have to be punished. If you're in debt, you have to pay the debt. And these two metaphors run together, starting in Anselm and into Calvin. Augustine a little bit has the roots of it, but it's elsewhere too and beyond him. But especially as you get into the early modern period with Calvin, where the only way for this situation to be made right is for God's debt to be paid, the debt that humans owe to God to be paid. Some of us grew up singing a song or two about this, right? He owed a debt. I owed a debt I could not pay. He paid a debt he did not owe. Anyways, yeah, this idea of indebtedness. Anselm's wild because he starts to pivot. The offense is really against a sovereign. He talks about when you sin, you dishonor God. Honor implies a relationship of subjection already, right? A hierarchical relationship, even in the idea itself. And he talks about when you sin, you steal God's property. He literally says you steal God's property. And so the answer is to pay it. Of course, Anselm's conundrum is humans can't pay it, but it has to come from humans for it to work. So you have the God-man Jesus, both human and God, who can satisfy it. But Anselm's clear: if not payment of debt, then some kind of punishment will suffice. And then that's where Calvin takes it and runs. And so salvation really is about return to subjection, and punishment subjects you, and paying a debt subjects you in a relation of obligation. And so salvation is really about that return to proper subjection. In the case of Christianity, if you want to give the benefit of the doubt, it's largely subjection to a God who cares for you, but it's also a God who is very much over you and has power over you. And so I think that I identify this in the book as really providing some of the intellectual, conceptual infrastructure that becomes material infrastructure for the systems of dealing with secular versions of sin in the form of crime and secular forms of salvation in the forms of correction or rehabilitation or whatever the institutions want to call it. I trace throughout the carceral penal traditions of how the framing around why people end up there is because they have refused proper subjection to some kind of master in society. And the first criminalized peoples in the beginning of capitalism were called masterless men and women, poor folks, wanderers, people who weren't working when they should have been, unhoused people, vagrants, all these terms. So the correction to that refusal to be subject to a master of some kind was to go and labor again, relearn the discipline of labor. Don't step out of line. When you return to society, you return as a contributing member again. You paid your debt to society. There's that language. You hear that a lot, even though that debt's never paid, if we're honest. After you're in prison, that debt is never paid. Because you're always subject to that history and judged on the basis of it. That really frames all of the carceral practice of the last couple of hundred years in this country, including the fact that penitentiary is the first name for the U.S. version of a prison. Penitence, you hear that in the word there. That's a theological concept.
I don't know why.
Religious reform.
I have no idea how I never made that connection. I was like, I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah, penitence. So you have to show that you're sorry for it, and act accordingly. And importantly, this is where last thing I'll say in response to this question is that a lot of people, even progressive, like well-meaning liberal folks, will think prisons have gotten off track. It used to be about kind of restoring people, rehabilitating people. Now people come out worse, and it's not good. And how can we change it to get back to how it used to be? Well, I have some bad news about that. It was never good. It was never for rehabilitation in a like holistic rehabilitation. It was always rehabilitation to being a disciplined laborer, being in your place in society, not stepping out of line in the hierarchies, knowing your role, etc. It was always rehabilitation to your place in a capitalist system, a white supremacist system. And importantly, even when there was some notion of you're going to come out better, meaning better about better in the sense of knowing your place, not better in the sense of a holistic human thriving or something, that requires a kind of a very physical and material subjection in prison. So you have in the first penitentiaries in the US very gruesome, grim, symbolic, and literal treatment of people who were entering the penitentiary for the first time, even in ways that resemble like death rituals and ceremonies. You lose your name, you get a number, you shave your head. Even in some cases, they would wear a kind of a shroud that resembled a burial shroud. The first wardens and chaplains would welcome people by saying, "You're being buried from the world here." And there was kind of this rhythm of death and resurrection, and it's kind of like in order to be resurrected, you had to be killed, virtually killed first. The old person being killed through the prison experience, and that's how you come out on the other side. And they weren't embarrassed about this. I mean, people would come and observe that it was very brutal, and they're like, "Yeah, because that's how you get reborn, is through that brutality." So it was never for rehabilitation in a holistic sense. It was always gruesome. It was always brutal, and it still is today.
I mean, that's yes. Again, this is how I felt like reading your book. Like you say something, just like, "Yep, that's pretty much sums it up," and it sounds terrible. What I had not and we're not really getting into it in this episode because we just don't have enough time, but you do such a good job of tying in capitalism into this. And I had not sufficiently take serious the role of work and the extractivist capitalism and the role of prisons. I understood it in terms of like private prisons, but what you helped me understand was how this is supposed to be a quote unquote some factor of a form of rehabilitation, the importance of like like doing something to that was supposed to be what cleansed you and heal you, so to speak, so that you could die to self and be reborn again. And it was through work that you shall be and I think you quote Genesis 3 somewhere in the book where about how you're gonna be known or be able to be fed by the sweat of your brow or whatever. And it reminded me of some of my research a lot of it takes place in Louisiana on plantations, and I talk about the state penitentiary of Louisiana, Angola, and how like it's on a actual plantation. Like the people who are in prison in Angola still work on a slave plantation. Like that is happening right now as we speak. If you listen to this podcast, that's what these people out there doing, right? And so that logic is still very real about how that's supposed to somehow purify you, and also how this is tied to extracting wealth and value from imprisoned bodies from those who have lord their power over them, who become themselves like God, so to speak. I want to toss it over to Wesley, because I know he had a question that I think can kind of take us to another couple places. Because honestly, like I said, we could probably talk to you another hour, but no one's gonna want to listen to that that much. But this is so deep, right? It's so deep.
I don't know.
Wesley.
I mean, I don't know. A 2-hour podcast on like 2x speed hits nicely for me, but we'll spare everyone from that reality. Dr. Harder, you mentioned something like having to think beyond what the carceral system might look like. Instilled maybe a little concern or fear, like what comes after that. I think capitalism robs us of our imagination in so many ways. Most recently, as I was reading your book and experiencing life here in Los Angeles, I was having a few things happening. I was reminded of maybe 6 months ago, a friend, I was hanging out with a friend, and their neighbor, we experienced some domestic violence on behalf of the neighbor to their partner, and we tried to aid. But after that, there was no like, what do we do now? Like, who do we call? This person clearly needs help. We've offered help. They've said no. The fighting continues. But what is the option? The calling 911 felt like the only thing within our ability. That ended fine. They ended up having to leave because without a police report, they couldn't do anything to the offender. So it's like these systems exist where the only way to get to any sort of recompense or any sort of reconciliation requires police engagement. And then a week ago, the train station that I use installed one set of metal detectors on one side of the station, staffed by 6 police officers. Yesterday, 4 of them were Latinx, one was a woman, one was a black man. Like the people upholding these systems continue to buy in as if not scanning the other side of the station means that somehow this side is good. There's a consistent lack of imagination of what works and what doesn't work. And at the same time, as Los Angeles faces all these budget cuts because of the amount of payouts from police misconduct, people continue to think, well, we have to give them more resources. We can't not move resources away from them. And so like all of this, these are all sort of barriers and structures that keep us from the truth and the reality. And on top of that, I think the other thing that I say, so much of our world is segregated that you can, with enough money, remove yourselves from having to experience homelessness or some of the negative effects of this police state and the carceral system. So in your book, you write that the ruling class claims that mass precarity is natural and thus inevitable. But this belief is also held by those subjected to this precarity. I'm talking about the police officers, people who move away from the cities to get away from the badness. I guess I'm curious, like, what have you found to be effective in helping people move away from this and other forms of capitalist realism?
There's a lot of questions in there. They're great questions. So I'll try to find my way in a hopefully helpful way.
You don't have to answer them all. Like
No, I know, no, yeah.
Wesley's the resident anti-capitalist. I mean, we're all anti-capitalist. But he's like super into the anti-capitalism. So.
Yeah, well, good company. Okay, so the first thing I think, if I can identify something, a trait of capitalism itself that will allow me to answer parts of the other questions around other things that work better, a trait of capitalism itself is that it atomizes people, it isolates people from one another. Um, the move from other economic and social arrangements, not that they were great, but in all ways, but capitalism was a transition marked by privatization in every realm. Land becomes privately owned, from being commonly owned in some places to being privately owned. The way that like households and communities are structured, it becomes more like individualized and isolated and atomized, and people lose touch with one another. Community starts to break down, and in the course of that, and of course, capitalism produces and depends upon mass inequality. And the early architects of capitalism are quite clear about that. They're not embarrassed about that fact. We can't have all this without poor people. They're very clear about that, which is why I'm an anti-capitalist as well, because it requires inequality, and I'm not down with that. I don't think God is either, if I can be clear. But what that does is it creates everyone is their own little island separated from one another. Capitalism generates policing as we know it today, in the sense that you have all these terrible outcomes of mass inequality, of people suffering and not having stability, and people end up more likely to commit things that are defined as crime because of their state of desperation, or because they've been impacted by violence. And so, our system of capitalism generates disorder, generates crime, even though it claims to be against those things fundamentally. And so what we have is a system that says that defines crime according to the behaviors of people who are at the bottom rungs of our social ladders, according to class and race and um, and ability and gender and sexuality in all kinds of ways. And another result of having been isolated from one another is that we've essentially outsourced the work of looking out for each other to these armed agents of the state. That is a product of capitalism, and policing is a product of capitalism, racial capitalism, and white supremacy. And so that means that our imagination has been severely limited, as you said, around how do we get to safety when bad things are happening? Well, if you go upstream a bit, you discover that bad things are happening on the scale they're happening in part because of mass inequality, forced inequality, deliberately designed inequality of various kinds. What Ruth Wilson Gilmore will call organized abandonment. It's very intentional abandonment of people and their needs for survival and thriving. And how do you deal with the outcomes of organized abandonment? You send in organized violence in the form of police and prisons. You deal with it in a reactive way as opposed to going upstream and preventing it. So our system of so-called public safety is entirely reactive in nature. It claims to be predictive in some ways, but it's still based upon a reaction to an already established social arrangement where there is massive amounts of deprivation and suffering. And then you have things like someone breaking into your car to steal something from it, or you have somebody hurting somebody else. And you could always trace it back, in most cases, to people not having their needs met, their social needs, their relational needs, their economic, financial needs, all kinds of needs that research has shown quite clearly. These are the drivers of violence and of like harm in society. And so, how does our society deal with those manifestations? It deals with them with the same tools it uses to create the problem in the first place: more violence, more isolation, separation from community, all the things that prison and police do, punishment, shame, etc. These are the things that create the violence that these systems supposedly respond to. Now, if we want to bypass all of that, you go back upstream, and the first question you ask is not about how do you deal with the instance of harm, though that should be asked as well, and I'll get to that in a second. But the first question is, how do we prevent it? How do we create conditions in which that is far less likely to happen than it is today? One of my favorite quotes I quote in the intro from the restorative justice practitioner and writer Danielle Sered, whose book Until We Reckon is highly recommended. She says, if prisons kept us safe, the US would be the safest nation in all of human history. And people usually laugh or smile or smirk when we put together the safest nation in all of human history and the United States. It's like, what? Far from it, right? It's such a dangerous place in so many ways. from gun violence to to murder and other forms of harm and sexual violence and all of it, super prevalent in our country. And that's because we've created it to be so. And we've then sent in us people with guns and badges and keys and cages to say, this is the way we get our way, we get our way back to safety, which is like the last thing that you would do if you really cared about safety. If you really cared about safety, you would prevent the bad things from happening as opposed to react to them after it's already been done. Just logistically, police come if they come at all after the bad thing has been done,
Yep.
if a bad thing has been done. And so the first thing is go upstream. The second thing is and prevent these things from happening in large part. But still, humans will hurt each other even if we do prevent a lot of it. So what do you do after that? You think about what needs to be addressed in the environment and in the individuals and in the relationships to stop this from happening again, to have some form of repair if it's possible, and to create a situation of safety on the other side of it. Prisons and police, um, not only do they not do all of that, they work night and day to ensure those things don't happen. That may sound hyperbolic, but I'm being very serious. Prisons go out of their way, the judicial system, the courts, all of that go out of their way to ensure that there is not meaningful exploration of the backgrounds upstream of people's backgrounds as to why it happened in a kind of like thoroughgoing way. It's just extracting a moment in time of harm and attending to it objectively, even though there is no objectivity with it. And then there's they go to great lengths to ensure that there is never any kind of meaningful process whereby people impacted and people who create the harm get to interact, not even on terms set by the survivor. That is not possible, and the prisons go to great lengths to ensure it doesn't happen. And therefore, what these institutions are doing, quite frankly, they're preventing the healing and the repair of the people who are impacted by the crime as well. So it is not just this is not just a matter of let's care about people who have hurt people. It's that, and it's also let's care about the people who deserve a lot more on the other side of being hurt by somebody. But right now, our system very actively does not allow that to happen. I've been to many parole hearings of folks who I knew on the inside. You'll have the family come who, decades after the fact, are still clinging desperately. The only thing they have for solace, please keep this person in a cage. Please keep this person in a cage. Please keep this person in a cage. That's all I have. That is such a bad deal. People deserve so much more than that. And there are avenues, real, tried and true and tested and experimented avenues for dealing with the problems in ways that prevent it from happening again and that give repair to the people who experienced it. And our systems do nothing for all of that. So we have a long way to go upstream and prevent and redirect our funds towards prevention as opposed to reaction. But there are lots of models that people are experimenting with around what are alternative forms of response, where people who don't have a gun and a badge show up, who are trained in de-escalation, who are trained in these kinds of things to help people navigate the situation after some harm has been done. And, in terms of sexual violence and assault and things like that, the majority of people who experience it do not ever report because they know that the system will either ensnare them in some way, potentially, especially if you're non-white or if you're a woman. You might end up getting punished instead of the person who hurt you. That happens all the time. Or because you know that it's not going to get you what you need and you might as well just go another path to deal with it. And so when I critique these systems of public safety, the first thing we have to ask is, what safety is it creating right now? And the answer is very little, even though it goes by the name of public safety institutions. And so this is this great myth and misnomer that lives so close to us that we can't even see that it's blinding us to the realities of the situation. And so, yeah, the book is an invitation in a lot of ways, especially in the conclusion and intro, to think beyond these ways of reacting to harm and to think much bigger in ways that I think actually resonate with the Christian tradition in many ways, in ways that don't resort to punishment to deal with the problems that our societies generate.
No, I mean that's such a helpful answer, and also I think revealing for people to come to understand. I think you write with piercing clarity how our prison system makes things worse. Like it's objectively making things worse, and the resistance that are policing the police unions. And I love how you say it's not really a union. I hadn't really. Anyway, I was like,
not.
I get so. I know it's not. I know it's not. But he was like, I'm like, you know what? They're not. You're because I'm from Michigan originally, so grew up. I would say the labor unions for me were almost religious, like because everyone in my family that had moved out of poverty is because of the auto industry. So we were a super union, which created a kind of solidarity within me, which deeply influences the way I think about Christianity, right? Like but it's more of like the radical union is not like the, um, different, I would say, than what we see what we see happening right now. But I want to make sure we spend at least the end part of the podcast doing some constructive work. And so some of this for our listeners is going to be about doing some constructive theology work in terms of how can we reform some of our theological assumptions and beliefs to help us then move towards creating and imagining. Because I think some of what stunts our imagination is holding on to these, what I will call, just for lack of a better term, like just bad theological beliefs, right? Like harmful theologies that stifle our imagination. And one of them is around hell. And so I'll turn it over to Everest to kind of pose that question, because I know, Everest, you said this was something you and your partner were talking about prior to even reading the book.
Yeah, I am so thankful for this book, and I think it came into my life at a really amazing time because a few months ago we saw a short article that was basically like, if you are trying to have conversations with people about prison, even prison reform, you have to first somehow deconstruct the idea of hell with them. Because if you are talking to someone who believes that there is something, anything that someone could do that makes it okay for them to be tortured for eternity, then of course they're going to feel great about throwing a 18-year-old in a cage for the rest of their life, or throwing anyone in a cage for the rest of their life. And I think that, I mean, that idea, that was kind of the moment that it clicked for me, and I was like, whoa, these things cannot be disentangled from each other. That is so obvious. And then reading your book, I was like, people be thinking about this. That's great. And you write about it so beautifully, and it was so eye-opening. And so I guess my question is, you being someone that obviously knows so much about this, spend so much of your time thinking about this, what is the first step you take if you're having a conversation with someone to kind of break through that idea? Because like Dr. Carter said, I think we have all internalized it so much that punishment is okay, or that people, they like, prisons are bad, but people are ultimately getting what they deserve, or I don't know. So I guess my question for you is, once we have accepted this idea that people's acceptance of the carceral system is really tied to their beliefs about hell, probably, what are the steps you take to like start the ball rolling in their brain to unlearn either of those ideas? I guess specifically starting from a theology of hell.
Yeah, great question. And again, many questions in one. But that's not a critique. It's an affirmation of the question. So, uh, one step back that I like to take, actually, this is how I start a lot of my talks with, like when I'm talking to church groups, I turn it into a meditation exercise where I invite people to kind of get comfortable, close their eyes, take the deep breaths and all that stuff, and then to imagine a time in their life, either in the past or in an imagined future, where they feel fully safe and at peace and free. And I give some people some time. I kind of leave some silence in there and kind of guide it slowly for a few minutes, and then I ask people to share. And it's usually, things like at my grandmother's kitchen table, or with my best friend in the woods, or at this lake that I went to growing up. Or the ingredients are always food, nature, and people. And so I step back and say, when I ask you to tell me about the safest thing you could imagine, you imagined like food, provision, you imagined a relationship with people, and you imagined the natural world. Nobody mentioned prisons, nobody mentioned police when I asked you to imagine safety. So that's its own learning experience. And so that starts us down the path. I think it's a way of disarming people. I think it allows people to arrive at the deep insight about what safety actually could be through their own experience and their own memory and their own like tactile, like sense-based experience. I ask people to imagine what they smell and hear and see and taste and things like that. And that I think is important, because if you just go at people with like, just let me tell you why we should burn it all down, people are not gonna listen right away. I usually, by the very end, I'm using the word abolition and talking about it in relation to my faith. For instance, saying that there, just historically speaking, there was a time before prisons and police, and probably historically speaking, there will be a time after them. And my faith is a part of my hope that there will be a time after them. And I kind of unpack that a little bit. But anyways, that's the end. The beginning is to imagine safety otherwise, do what we already know. And that is what the vision of abolition really is a vision of safety by other means that we already are familiar with. We've just been taught to forget them. That people know how to care for each other and deal with problems without resorting to calling an agent of the state. The second place I start when it comes to a theological question of hell is hell on earth. And that may seem like it's just a political question with a theological veneer, but I think it's actually also a theological question about hell. The idea of hell, first of all, comes from seeing hellish conditions on earth and imagining an afterlife situation filled in by the details of the things that people witness on this planet, of people hurting and torturing and killing and maiming each other. And so that is it's a very anthropological, earthbound starting place that maybe not everyone would be into. But I think that God comes to us in the world that we know. Our theology is informed and shaped, even our scripture is shaped by this world and experiences here. And that's just a fact of our finite capacities and et cetera. I start by being, I'm an abolitionist, a theological abolitionist of hell, first of all, in the hell on earth sense. And it's important to note that, uh, as I do in the book, that images of hell have often been informed from the cognate images of prison on earth, and vice versa. Prison is very regularly, I cite a few examples, but I come across them constantly still when I read of people comparing prison to hell. And so they're like these mutually informative concepts or images or visions of suffering. And so I don't think they actually can be extracted. So they not only do they go together, they shouldn't be separated, because understanding a theological concept of an afterlife hell really needs to be understood through the hells that are already made on earth for people. And I'm against those, and I think that hell on earth should be abolished in all of its forms. I will end on an ambiguous note that I am of multiple minds around how that relates to the more abstracted eternal hell idea. I, at this point, do not really consent in theological abstraction to hell in the form of eternal torment as a theological reality necessarily at this point in my everyday faith and thinking. But there is the part of me that sometimes doesn't want to let go entirely, if I'm totally transparent, is the part of me that thinks about, and this is a biblical idea too, that I pepper throughout the text in little ways without identifying it as such. But there's precedent in certain parts of scripture for those who create conditions of, and this is my language on it, but who create conditions of hell will eventually find themselves there as well. The punishment you give to others will be the thing that will come back and get you in the end. You reap what you sow. And there is part of me that is kind of man, the people who are creating so much hell on earth for people, as a rhetorical, heuristic, actionable, livable, inhabitable, theological and political idea now, I have a hard time letting go of some aspects of people are going to fall into the pit they dig for others as well in some form or fashion. There's a kind of spiritual death that maybe will also result in some kind of suffering. I mean, I'm thinking about people right now who are on this planet who are creating such hell right now, in Palestine and in our own country. And I don't know if I'm really at a place right now theologically where I jump to anticipation of seeing them beyond some pearly gates, if I'm quite honest. But that doesn't mean that I am big into their eternal torment either. I mostly end up arriving back at, what we know for sure is that there is hell on earth. And what we know for sure is that Christians are called to dismantle hell on earth. That may relate in some cosmic sense to what happens beyond death, but I am somewhat agnostic and mostly just go back to the politics of it, which is a theopolitics of it for me. So apologies that that's not the most satisfactory answer, but that's where
No,
I'm at on it.
I think that's a great answer, because I think so many of us. I mean, we get lots of listener questions about how do we, and we've done episodes on sin and on salvation, all these other kinds of constructive things, because I think many of us are trying to work through new theologies of flourishing in light of the ways in which we've been taught theologies that have harmed us in some way, shape, or form. And I think hell is definitely one of them. And the thing I think we struggle with, that I hear you describing, is accountability. Where is their accountability, right? And accountability doesn't have to be a prison, but what does accountability look like? I don't know. And this is where I think to rely, I guess, on somewhat of an old trope, one might say, but I don't know if I wouldn't call it a trope. This is where I do have faith. There is some form of accountability. I don't know what that is. And it is not my job to know what that is, because I am not God. I believe in a free God. Like, God has freedom enough to decide how God will hold people accountable. My responsibility as a person of faith, as a Christian, is to eliminate the conditions for hell on earth, right? And so I think for me, that is, I try to teach a theology about controlling the controllables, about doing the things that I know we ought to do, and not so much trying to be. Because what happens is, and you describe it so well in this book, how people begin to try to become God. They try to they deify themselves, and they're like, and like
Right.
I'm like, that's a slippery slope. I'm like, that's not my role. I'm gonna stay in my. It's like I tell my son, like, I'm the parent, you're the child, you know? And I'm like, we each got our own responsibilities and jobs. We're going to do our things. I think so. The last question I want to ask, and this is, again, building on Everett's question. So I was reading this and I'm thinking this whole time, okay, how am I going to introduce this to my, congregation and my community? What does this mean for me now that have already thought a lot about, I've read about abolition, but I think so I guess I have this is more of a statement. I want to get your feedback on it. So you end the book and you talk about, transformative justice and restorative justice as really key critical practices for us to begin to imagine this new world beyond the carceral system, right? So therefore, our carceral system doesn't function from a religious perspective. And I think you do a good persuasive argument of describing how mass incarceration or mass criminalization is a religion, or has religious nuances, if you will. I couldn't help but believe the way the way you end the book and you describe your vision of abundance and abolition and what that might look like. It brought me back to the beginnings of Mark, so the earliest gospel that we have that's written, when Jesus comes in right after John gets arrested. Like, so I'm looking at, right, Mark 1:14-15. After John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee announcing God's good news, saying that now is the time, here comes God's kingdom, change your hearts and lives and trust this good news. Like, I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, Jesus was an abolitionist. Like, Jesus, Jesus was about abolishing the conditions by which created the hell on earth you described, and saying the kingdom of God is at hand, which is how I learned it. Because I'm learning King James. I got a little bit of King James NRSV verses stuck up in there. It's very much about this both. It's both, and it's both now and coming in the future. When Jesus is talking about the good news in the kingdom of God, it is about alleviating what's happening now, the suffering his community is experiencing now, the oppression they're experiencing from the Roman Empire now, and also in anticipation of God fulfilling God's promises laid out in the Mosaic commandment, reaffirmed in the promise of Jeremiah, right, and lived out in his community in that time. And you even see this explicit when he does his first public sermon in Luke, when he's quoting Isaiah, and he's Luke 4 verses 14-20, when he opens the Isaiah scroll, when he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, the recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This is abolition. I'm like, this is what Jesus is talking about. And I hadn't thought about it like that. So for me, your book gave me the language to talk about Jesus as a community organizer and as an abolitionist that give people, could hopefully prompt their imaginations, right? To imagine what it could be like to think of a Christianity that's deeply tied to an abolitionist vision and framework, rather than the carceral framework that's tied to the soteriologies and things that we talked about earlier. How does that resonate with you? Like, is that something that feels right in terms of your own perspective in reading?
It does resonate with me. I Luke 4 is central to my spirituality of abolition, I would say. I did a paper in my master's degree on like who are the captives in Luke 4 and in Isaiah. And because so much of what I grew up with was it's the spiritually captive, people's captive to sin, captive to their own addictions, to their own ways, etc. And I think that the answer with the most integrity that I could find based on like the research I did on the commentaries and the different things is that listeners would not have been able to hear that without some dimension of a material political aspect because of the world around them. They know that the captives are those who are captive because they're in debt to somebody or else, or some relationship of obligation that they can't satisfy, to go back to that. And so there's release from that relationship of subjection or of obligation in an abusive sense. So people hearing that would have heard at least to some extent, some maybe a major extent. The captives are like people who are physically like captive in some way, and it's likely too that because the spiritual and the material like are not so distinct in the ancient ways that as they are at our point in time, that it wouldn't have been hard to also hear spiritual transcendent meaning in that related to what people are bound to beyond the material as well. So that both of those things are in there at once. And I think that really fits with abolition as well, because abolition, as I understand it, is not just about physically tearing down the walls of prisons and police stations, though I like when that happens. I think it's just as much, if not maybe more so in some ways, about the dismantling of the walls on our imagination and the ways that we are police to others and that we hold others captive through our actions or through the things that we participate in without even realizing it. The ways that what our purchases do and what our consent to different things do to other people's well-being in our society. And so, yes, it resonates fully with me. I do think that interpreting Jesus in terms of abolition is really possible and valuable and generative. And abolition, not just I can wrap up with this, not just in the sense of what that word tends to sound like to people, which when you hear abolition, you hear destruction of something. Right? You're taking away something, a subtraction, if you will, of some kind. The people who are writing about abolition today that have really compelled me to think more broadly is to think about abolition as not just a subtraction, but as an addition. It's the creation of new conditions, the creation of new practices, which may be based on very old practices in some cases, including indigenous ones, thinking about restorative justice and other things like that. That abolition is not just about let's put a target on all of these buildings and institutions and cut them out of our budgets and of our lives. It's about how can we displace those, make them obsolete by creating conditions where we no longer feel we have to depend upon them in the way that we do now. There's one metaphor that I like of people talking about abolition as a brick. It's the figurative brick through the police station window, but it's also the brick that you build something else with. And so I think that that inevitably, like a lot of people think about revolutions and things like that as a one-off. The revolution begun at this time on this day, and everything was different from that point forward. But I think both theologically and politically and sociologically, it's more gradual than that. I think we're in a revolutionary moment right now, maybe without realizing it, in politically, so societally, where things may change in some major ways, and this empire may, in fact, have an end date on it of some kind. Um, it's scary, but maybe holds some promise as well. And it's also the case then that like the future vision is already breaking in, to use a theological terminology, like that's already begun to be present. And likewise, wherever people are being housed in housing that they can afford to live in permanently, wherever people are having their healthcare needs met, wherever people are forming relationship with people around them where they didn't have it before, wherever people are receiving accountability that's life-giving for them and the person they hurt, wherever people have access to food and to transportation and to the things that they need to live, and access to nature and access to the things that people need to thrive. Abolition is already breaking in and through those things. That's what I'll say. But my understanding of abolition is that it's not just a far off, distant goal. It's the horizon that we already have at least one foot in when we are participate in those kinds of transformation of conditions, but also of spirit and of persons who are able to move through the world differently than we are situated to move through it under racial capitalism and a carceral society. So my vision of of abolition, I think I understand it theologically in that sense of it. If it breaks in now, it's here and there. We can encounter it. We can help build it. But hopefully one day it will come in the fullness. And I may at that point just almost completely conflate what I understand to be the eschatological end of salvation and liberation and the one on earth as well. So I'll end it there.
Andrew, this was so great. This was so great, and I'm so thankful for you to be able to join us on this episode. I would say that the Wesley and Everest, like this, the kind of conversations that you just have. These are like, I always tell people our podcast is like basically our text chains and sidebar conversations that we can have just in public, and we've discovered that other people apparently are interested in these conversations as well, and in a way that gives me hope. And I do believe, at least the four of us, we know we're on the precipice of a revolutionary moment. Like you can't have military coming into the cities of which it's their home territory and not understand that something is happening, right? You can't deploy National Guard troops. Like my 6-year-old son saw people in giant cars in military fatigues with machine guns, and we're driving to the United Methodist Church annual conference, and he's like, "Daddy, what is that?" Right? Like we know what's happening, right? And so this is the moment that we're in, and I think what your book does invites us to imagine that next thing that we can create, Lord willing, that it will be different and more towards a beloved community that we all long for. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your excellent work and your scholarship and this amazing conversation, for agreeing to be on the podcast with us. Please pick up his book. Be in a church reading group. If you have to read by yourself, just take your time.
Email.
I'm like, take your time. Maybe have some, beverage in it that could settle you down. Because it's gonna take you there. It's gonna take you there. But that's how, that's how we learn. That's how we grow. It's gonna stretch you. But in all the ways that I think are beautiful and that I love. So I thank you for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast. The Progressive Christian Podcast is a ministry of the Loft, a worship community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. Shout outs to our wonderful audio engineer, AJ. Thank you for all the heavy lifting that you do. We want to invite you to please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using. Shout out to our YouTube subscribers, because they are stepping it up. We're getting way more of those, and we are trying to defeat the algorithm of conservative, propaganda-filled, bad theological Christianity that's on there, to have more hope-filled, joyous, progressive, liberatory Christianity that people can find in the algorithm. So thank you all for leaving your comments and for the likes and subscribes. We appreciate it. And thank you all for listening, and we'll see y'all next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you so much.